The morning my little brother sat the national exam, the city looked rinsed clean, as if someone had polished every leaf with a damp cloth and decided to be kind to nervous teenagers for once. Hoy had spent a year hoarding pocket money, and, with the solemn pride of a boy pretending not to be sentimental, bought me a fitted jade green dress with a high slit and a stand collar. He called it lucky, the same way he called instant noodles nutritious, and his own handwriting readable. I put it on anyway, because the gift wasn't about fashion. It was about effort. Before we left, I found my mother's old hairpin in the top drawer of her vanity, an unremarkable thing, with a faint floral carving, and twisted my hair up, fastening it with more care than I gave to most deadlines. Outside, I practically skipped, basking in the attention of strangers who turned their heads, because a woman in a dress like that did not usually ferry a boy with a clear pencil case to an exam. "See?" he crowed, elbowing me. "My sister's a total stunner. If you want her chat ID, that'll be 50. I smiled the kind of smile that kept my hands from making contact with the back of his skull. At the school gate, 3 boys in matching white shirts waited, sweating through bravery. 2 of them greeted me like I was a teacher. The third, taller and paler, forgot how to stand with his shoulders even. His ears went red so quickly it looked like a magician's trick. "This is Anne," I announced. "My friend. He's quiet." Quiet was a weak word for the way Anne held himself, careful, contained, like a clean sheet folded too neatly to be used. When his eyes met mine, he blinked once, as if he had to confirm I was real, and then looked down with the fear of a boy who had never learned what to do with attention that wasn't a teacher's. I wished him luck with a gentle voice, because there are moments when tenderness is a weapon you choose on purpose, and nodded so hard his fringe bounced. Hu whooped, slapped his friends on the shoulders, and ran inside before I could give him a proper warning about being late. I was halfway to the taxi stand when a shout scraped across the crowd like a dull knife. I did not need to turn my head to know who it belonged to. Vin Dong, my regrettable ex, had a talent for making his name sound like a stain. I dumped him a month earlier after discovering he treated monogamy like an optional app update, and he had responded by hovering around my life as if persistence could rewrite consent. I didn't dignify him with a glance. I altered course, wove into a cluster of parents, and slipped toward the row of motorbike taxis. He lunged through the people, calling my name with the entitlement of a man who thinks being left is a negotiation. The driver I flagged revved his engine at precisely the right moment, and I swung onto the seat, skirt gathered, hairpin steady, dignity intact. We pulled away, leaving Vin choking on exhaust in the rearview mirror. I laughed, not because the situation was funny, but because relief sometimes demands sound. On the ride back to campus, I checked my phone. A friend request sat at the top. Anne, with a plain white profile picture and a username so simple it felt deliberate. I accepted out of curiosity, the way you open a door to see whether the hall is bright. A message arrived seconds later. "Thank you for today. Hoy said you're in university nearby. Please be careful." I stared at the screen. It was an odd thing for a boy who couldn't look at me to say, and it carried the gentle firmness of someone who was used to standing guard in silence. I typed back, "Careful is my middle name," and then added, "because I could not help myself. Also, tell Hui I'm charging interest for the 50 he promised to collect." Anne replied with a single embarrassed emoji, and, after a pause, "I will wait here until his exam ends. If anything happens, call me." I should have rolled my eyes. Instead, the smallest warmth slid into my chest, uninvited and inconvenient. Over the next 2 days, the exam schedule ruled the world. Hui left early each morning like a soldier marching to a battlefield of multiple-choice questions. Parents pressed bottled water into hands, teachers shouted encouragement, and the air smelled of sun-warmed concrete and fear. I brought Hai to the gate again, and each time Anne was already there, upright beside the fence with an umbrella, a small cooler bag, and the expression of someone trying to be invisible while failing spectacularly. He offered Hai a mint before each session, as if sweetness could bribe fate. When Hai disappeared into the building, and stayed, not for Hai. Hai had friends, noise, a whole ecosystem, but for me, he did not hover. He simply existed in the same space, alert without being pushy, eyes scanning the street whenever a motorbike slowed. On the second afternoon, Vin's message arrived. "We need to talk." Then another. "Don't make me come over." I didn't answer. A black helmet drifted too close to the curb, and my stomach tightened, and noticed before I spoke. He stepped forward, positioned himself between me and the road with a polite angle that looked accidental to anyone not paying attention. "Is it him?" he asked, voice low. I wanted to tease him for his bluntness, but my pulse was already racing. "Yeah," I admitted. "He's the kind of man who confuses persistence with romance." Anne's jaw tightened, and for a second the shy boy who blushed at greetings vanished. "He shouldn't be here," he said. "If he comes closer, tell me." The helmeted rider circled once, saw Anne's stance, and peeled away. Anne didn't celebrate. He just exhaled, as if holding his breath was part of his job. When Hai emerged later, eyes glassy with exhaustion, he flung an arm around Anne and called him a hero for saving him a spot in the shade. Hui never noticed that Anne's hand was shaking slightly when he offered me the last bottle of water. After the final exam, Hui and his friends exploded into the street like fireworks, shouting, laughing, insulting the exam writers with the sincerity of teenagers who think the universe cares. I watched them with the soft ache of an older sibling who has already learned that freedom always arrives wearing the mask of panic, and hung back, waiting until Hai sprinted off to take group photos. "You're safe now," he told me, and the phrase sounded like a vow he was repeating for himself. "Thank you," I said. "You didn't have to stand guard like a security camera for 3 days." His ears reddened. "I wanted to," he confessed, then looked startled at his own honesty. I took his phone from his hands before he could regret it, and typed my number into his contacts with a flourish. "There," I said. "Now you can worry efficiently." He let out a breath that was half laugh, half surrender. We walked toward the bus stop together, and for the first time he talked about something that wasn't an exam. His plan to study engineering, his habit of reading manuals for fun, the way he collected tiny facts like coins. He kept glancing at my hairpin, and when I asked why, he said, "It looks like it was chosen with care." Nobody had ever complimented a hairpin before. The bus arrived, crowded and loud. I stepped up, and Anne followed, shielding me from the crush with his shoulder. The city rattled around us, and I realized my fear had loosened its grip. In that small breathing space, I caught myself wondering what Anne looked like when he wasn't trying so hard to be good. The thought was absurdly intimate, and it made me stare out the window as if the buildings could explain me to myself. Vin did not give up because men like him mistake refusal for a puzzle. One evening, after I finished a late library shift, I found him waiting near my dorm entrance, leaning against his motorbike like he owned the sidewalk. His smile carried the old arrogance that had once fooled me into thinking confidence was strength. "Lynn," he said, stretching my name as if it belonged to him. "You've been ignoring me." I kept walking. He stepped into my path. "You can't just throw me away," he insisted. The sentence was so revealing it could have been a confession in court. I raised my phone. "Move, or I call campus security." Vin chuckled, eyes flicking to my dress as if he was doing inventory. "Security?" he mocked. "You think they'll take your side if I say you led me on?" I felt anger rise, cold and clean. Before I could answer, a voice cut through the space like a door opening. "Step back," and appeared from the darkness, backpack still on, hair damp from rain, expression stripped of softness. Vin looked him up and down and laughed. "Who's this? Your new puppy?" Anne didn't respond to the insult. He simply moved, placing his body between us with the same careful angle as at the exam gate, but this time there was no pretense of accident. "You are trespassing," Anne said. "Leave." Vin's smile hardened. He reached out, aiming for my wrist. Anne's hand caught his forearm midair. The motion was fast, controlled, and quiet, like a lock clicking shut. Vin yelped, tried to jerk free, and swung, and dodged and pushed him back with a shove that sent him stumbling into his own bike. The sound of metal clattering echoed. Campus guards appeared at the commotion, flashlights snapping on. Vin cursed, spat a final threat, and peeled away into the night. Anne's shoulders stayed tense until the engine noise faded. Only then did he turn to me and shrug off his jacket, draping it over my shoulders as if warmth could erase what I'd seen. "Are you hurt?" he asked. I shook my head, but my hands trembled, and noticed and covered my fingers with his own, steady and warm, as if lending me balance. "You shouldn't face him alone again," he said. "Promise me." I wanted to joke, to reclaim power with sarcasm, yet the sincerity in his voice made joking feel like dropping a fragile dish. "Okay," I agreed. "I promise." After that night, Anne became part of my routine with alarming ease. He walked me from the library. He waited outside my lecture hall with a drink that wasn't too sweet because he had memorized my complaints. He didn't demand anything. He simply appeared, consistently, like a quiet lamp left on. I teased him through messages because it felt safer than acknowledging how much I liked his steadiness. I called him Clean Slate because his profile picture was still blank and his name was still simple, and he replied with embarrassed protests that made me grin in the cafeteria like an idiot. When he finally changed his avatar to a photograph, a blurry shot of a cat sitting on a motorcycle helmet, I told him it was a bold, artistic statement. He wrote, "It's my neighbor's cat." And then, after a pause, "It liked me." I stared at the text and imagined, and standing still while a cat decided he was trustworthy, the image made my throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with laughter. One Saturday, I dragged him to a street food stall and ordered skewers until the table looked like a miniature forest, and watched me eat with a kind of stunned respect. "You're not worried about calories?" he asked. "I'm worried about missing out," I corrected. A smear of chili sauce landed on his lip while he tried to copy my reckless bite. Without thinking, I reached out with my thumb and wiped it away. The touch lasted 1 second. It felt like a thunderclap, and froze, eyes wide, as if someone had pressed pause on him. I pulled back, suddenly aware that my boldness could be a weapon too. "Sorry," I muttered. "I forgot you're new at this." His ears burned crimson. "I'm not afraid of you," he blurted, then immediately regretted the sentence because what he meant was something far gentler. I leaned in, playful again because play was my armor. "Good," I said. "Because I'm not the scary one. The world is. Our first real fight was stupid, which is how you know you're becoming real." A rumor spread that I was dating a senior in my department, a guy who lent me notes. Vin's shadow still hovered in my brain, so I hadn't told many people about Anne, and silence invited invention. Anne heard the rumor from Hoy, who delivered it with the careless curiosity of a brother who didn't understand that words can bruise. That evening, Anne showed up outside my dorm and stood there, hands clenched, eyes dark. "Is it true?" he asked. The question wasn't accusing, it was terrified. I felt my patience snap, because being doubted felt like being chased all over again. "Why would you believe that?" I demanded, and swallowed. "Because I don't know what I am to you," he admitted. The honesty punched the air out of me. I had been flirting like it was a game, using confidence to hide the fact that commitment scared me. I stepped closer and tilted my head. "Then ask," I said. "Don't guess." Anne's hands shook. "What am I to you?" he whispered. My chest tightened, and for once I couldn't escape into jokes. "You're the person who shows up," I said slowly. "You're the one who stood between me and someone who thought he owned me. You're the one who waits without asking to be paid. If you want a label, you can call it whatever you like, but don't call it nothing." Anne's eyes glistened. He reached out, then stopped, as if asking permission with his entire body. I took his hand and placed it on my waist. "I'm not dating that senior," I added, voice softer. "I'm learning how to date you." A laugh escaped, and shaky and relieved, like a knot untying, he squeezed my hand once, reverent, as if he'd been handed a fragile relic. It was only after I fell for Anne that I noticed the places he didn't let me see. He avoided changing clothes in front of anyone, even in the cramped dorm room he shared with roommates. He flinched at sudden movements, and he never raised his voice, even when angry, as if volume itself was a threat. One rainy afternoon, we hid in a cafe near campus while thunder walked across the sky. Anne's sleeve rode up when he reached for his cup, and I saw the pale, jagged line across his forearm, a scar old enough to have stopped hurting but fresh enough to still speak. I didn't touch it. I didn't demand an explanation. I simply looked at him until he understood I'd noticed, and stared at his coffee for a long time, then said, "My mother did that." The words landed with a dull finality. He continued in a flat voice, as if describing someone else's life. His father had money, a family, and a reputation he defended like glass. Anne had been an accident from a drunken night, a secret held in an envelope until it became inconvenient. 2 years earlier, his father had brought him home to prove he was generous, but the home had not wanted him. The woman who carried the title of mother in that house treated Anne like a stain. She said I should be grateful to even exist. Anne murmured. She said love is earned by being perfect. So I tried. He smiled without humor. It didn't work. Something hot and protective surged through me, fierce enough to frighten me with its clarity. I reached across the table and took his hand. "You don't have to be perfect to be loved," I said. "You have to be alive." Anne's throat bobbed. "I don't think I'm worth the trouble," he whispered. I leaned forward. "Then I'll be the trouble," I promised. Later, when he showed me the larger scar curving along his ribs, a souvenir from a belt buckle, I didn't cry, because I refused to give his abuser the satisfaction of my tears. Instead, I said, practical and stubborn, "We can cover it." Anne frowned. "With what?" I grinned. "Ink," I said. "A design that belongs to you. Something that turns a wound into a story you control." We went to a tattoo studio recommended by a classmate who had a constellation on her collarbone and an obsession with turning pain into art. The studio smelled like disinfectant and incense, like a hospital trying to be cool. The artist, a woman with silver hair and patient eyes, listened to Anne's story without flinching. "You don't have to hide it," she said, "but you can choose what you see when you look down." And sat on the chair, shirt lifted, skin pale under the lamp. My heart squeezed at how vulnerable he looked. I held his hand as the needle began to buzz, and didn't scream, didn't even swear. He just breathed through it, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on a point on the wall. I realized then that his quiet wasn't weakness, it was endurance. When it was done, a line of bamboo curved over his scar, leaves unfolding where pain used to be. The green-black ink made the old mark look like a shadow beneath a living thing, and stared at it in the mirror, stunned, as if he'd never imagined his body could hold beauty without permission. "It's yours," I told him, "not hers." He nodded, and for the first time I saw him stand taller, not because he was trying to please, but because he wanted space for himself. That night we walked along the river, city lights melting into the water, and stopped beneath a street lamp and reached up, hesitant, to touch my hairpin. "Your mother's?" he asked. I nodded. "She's gone," I said quietly. "But sometimes I still feel her here." Anne's fingers hovered, not quite touching my hair. "Then you're brave," he said. I laughed softly. "No," I corrected. "I'm stubborn," he smiled, and the expression transformed him into someone younger, freer, almost mischievous. My roommate Yen broke up with her boyfriend in the most dramatic way possible. She threw his hoodie onto our dorm floor, sat on her bed, and cried like the world had cracked. I spent hours rubbing her back, making tea, threatening violence in creative metaphors, and wishing I could sew her heart together with thread, and texted to ask if I wanted to meet for dinner, and I replied that I couldn't leave. "She's not okay," I wrote. "Don't wait," Anne answered. "I will not wait outside. I will wait in your life." The sentence was so earnest it made me put my phone down and stare at the ceiling as if the concrete might explain how a boy like him existed. When Yen finally fell asleep with her face on my shoulder, exhausted by grief, I stepped into the hallway and called On. He picked up on the first ring. "Are you safe?" he asked immediately. "I'm safe," I said, "but I'm thinking about you." There was a pause, then a shy inhale. "I'm thinking about you too," he confessed. The next day, Yen woke up with puffy eyes and a determination that scared me more than her tears. "I'm joining the gym," she declared. "I'll turn heartbreak into abs." I applauded her, because sometimes you support the coping mechanism even if it's ridiculous. Our first kiss happened under a concrete awning while rain turned the campus courtyard into a shimmering mirror. It wasn't cinematic. Someone coughed nearby. A scooter honked. My hairpin threatened to loosen, yet the kiss itself was startlingly gentle, as if Anne was afraid to bruise me with his mouth. I pulled back and laughed, because I needed to break the intensity before it swallowed us. Anne looked panicked. "Did I do it wrong?" he asked. His vulnerability was so pure it could have cut glass. I covered his eyes with my hand, because I suddenly felt shy on his behalf. "Stop asking the world for grades," I whispered near his ear. "This isn't an exam." Anne made a helpless sound, half laugh, half sigh, and pressed his forehead against mine. "If you promise me one thing," he said, voice rougher than usual, "I'll stop worrying so much." I raised a brow. "Only one?" He nodded. "Promise you won't disappear without telling me," he said. The request wasn't possessive. It was wounded. I thought of my mother's empty room, the hairpin, the sudden absences life specializes in. I cupped Anne's jaw. "I won't vanish," I promised. "If I have to leave, I'll say goodbye properly. And if I stay, I'll stay loudly." Anne's eyes shone. "Then I will stay too," he said, and the words felt like a bridge. The first time, Anne and I went on an actual date, an evening chosen on purpose. Rather than a hallway collision, we ended up at a small museum that nobody visited because it didn't have air conditioning. We wandered among old photographs of the city. Street vendors balancing poles, students on bicycles, mothers carrying baskets like they carried the whole future, and read every caption, serious as a scientist, while I watched his face change as he connected to lives that existed before ours. At one display, a glass case held a set of hair ornaments from decades ago, simple and worn. I pointed at them and said, "That's what my mother's hairpin feels like, ordinary until you realize it survived everything." Anne looked at me and said, "Then you survived everything too." The compliment landed softly but did not disappear. It settled into my ribs and warmed the place where grief used to sit. After the museum, we ate sweet tofu pudding from paper cups and argued about whether the best part was the syrup or the peanuts, and insisted it was the texture. I insisted it was the chaos. The vendor laughed at us like we were a TV show. When we walked home, Anne told me about the first time he learned to cook. His father's house had a kitchen larger than my dorm, yet nobody had taught him how to boil eggs because nobody planned for him to be loved. I told him about my mother teaching me to re-sew buttons, saying, "If a thing can be fixed, don't throw it away." We both understood she had not meant clothes alone. Vin tried a different strategy when brute force failed. He became a rumor. One day, a classmate forwarded me screenshots from an anonymous account claiming I was a gold digger who seduced men and cried abuse when bored. The posts were written with the lazy cruelty of someone who thought women's reputations were disposable. My stomach turned. Not because I believed strangers, but because I knew how quickly lies travel when they wear a familiar outfit. And saw my hands shaking and asked what was wrong. When I showed him the screenshots, his expression went still. "We can report it," he said immediately. "We can prove it's him." I had expected anger, not solutions. My throat tightened again, because this was what Anne offered. Not dramatic speeches, but steps. We went to the student affairs office together and laid out the timeline. Messages, sightings, the recorded video, the new anonymous posts. He spoke calmly, as if presenting evidence for a thesis, and the staff listened because calm looks credible. The anonymous account was traced to a cafe Wi-Fi Vin often used. A formal complaint was filed. When campus security called Vin in, he tried to laugh it off, tried to imply we were jealous of his attention, tried to charm his way out the way he always had. He failed, because the world behaves differently when you bring receipts. He was banned from campus. He sent me one final message, "You'll regret this," and then went silent. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt tired, the kind of tired that comes from realizing how much energy it takes to stay safe. That night, Anne sat beside me on the dorm steps and said, "You didn't do this to him. He did it to himself." I leaned my head on his shoulder and let myself be tired without pretending to be invincible, and met Yen properly the week after that. She marched up to him in the cafeteria, arms crossed, and said, "So you're the famous one," and almost dropped his tray. I nearly choked on my soup. Yen studied him with the seriousness of a customs officer, then nodded once. "Okay," she decided. "You look like you'd cry if you stepped on an ant, which means you might be safe," and blinked, confused. "I would apologize to the ant," he said earnestly, and Yen burst out laughing so hard she had to wipe her eyes. It was the first time I saw Anne relax around someone who wasn't me or Hui. Watching him earn laughter instead of suspicion made something in me unclench, as if my own guard duty could finally share a shift. Later, in our room, Yen said, "He's good for you." I rolled my eyes. "I don't need a man to be good for me." Yen shrugged. "Sure, but it's nice when someone makes your life softer." I stared at my mother's hairpin on the desk and admitted, reluctantly, that softness was not the same as weakness. The anniversary of my mother's death arrived without warning, even though it came on the same calendar date every year. Grief has a talent for disguising itself until it sits in your throat. I tried to act normal all day. Lectures, errands, jokes. By evening, my hands felt numb, and my chest felt crowded, and noticed the silence I didn't know I was wearing. "Do you want to go somewhere?" he asked. I could have lied. Instead, I nodded. We took a bus to the small cemetery outside the city where my mother rested under a stone that never captured her laugh. The grass was uneven, and the air smelled of wet soil. I knelt, brushed leaves away, and placed a packet of jasmine tea on the grave because it had been her favorite, and stayed one step behind me, not intruding, just present. When I finally spoke, My voice came out thin. She would have liked you, I said. She liked quiet people. She said they listened better, and swallowed. I'm sorry I never met her, he whispered. I touched my hairpin. You did, I said. In a way. On the bus ride back, the city lights blurred, and I leaned against Anne's shoulder. He didn't try to fix my sadness. He simply held my hand and let the sadness exist without judgment. That was the night I understood love as a kind of respectful silence that refuses to leave. Anne's family stormed back into our lives, near the end of semester, when his father discovered the tattoo. A sharp phone call, a demand to come home, a thinly veiled threat about funding, and shook as he listened, face tight. I waited until he hung up, then asked one question. What do you want? The question seemed to startle him, because his whole life had been built around what other people wanted. I want to finish school, he said slowly. I want to work. I want to stop being afraid. He looked at me, terrified of his own desire. But I don't know if I'm allowed. I took his hands. You're allowed, I said. They don't hand out permission. You take it. And met his father alone the next day in a restaurant that smelled like money. When he returned, his eyes were red but steady. I told him, I'm not a stain. He said, I told him I'm his son whether he likes it or not, and I'm a person whether he claims me or not. He exhaled shakily. He said I'm ungrateful. I lifted my chin. And you said? Anne's mouth twitched. I said I'm tired. It wasn't a dramatic victory, but it was a line drawn. Sometimes boundaries are quiet wars you win by refusing to step back. Hui left for his new university at the start of the rainy season. I helped him carry boxes up the dorm stairs, pretended not to see his eyes go glossy when he realized I wouldn't be there to nag him about meals. Before I left, he pressed something into my palm. A cheap keychain shaped like a tiny book. For your keys, he mumbled, and then added softer. And for your stories. On the train ride home, I stared at the keychain until my eyes burned, and sat beside me, knees angled protectively toward mine, and said, He'll be okay. I nodded, but what I really heard was, You'll be okay. Love, again, translating fear into something survivable. As graduation approached, the future stopped being abstract. Friends compared job offers like trading cards. Professors talked about internships with the casual cruelty of people who forget rent exists, and received an offer from a firm in another province, a good one with a salary that sounded like freedom. He should have been thrilled. Instead, he grew quiet. Old quiet. The kind that tasted like abandonment. One night, he admitted, If I leave, my father will say I'm running away. If I stay, I'm still in his shadow. I traced the bamboo tattoo with one finger and said, Then you choose the shadow you want, not the one they assign. We sat on the dorm rooftop, watching lightning flicker far away. I told him I was applying for editing work in the same province. Not because I needed him, but because I wanted to share mornings with him. Anne's eyes filled again. You always make decisions like you're jumping, he said. You're not scared? I laughed quietly. I'm terrified, I confessed. I just refuse to let terror drive. Anne looked at the city and nodded slowly, as if learning a new language called self. Graduation arrived under bright banners and hotter sun than anyone deserved. Families filled the auditorium, phones raised like offerings. Anne stood in line with his classmates, cap tilted, slightly askew, looking both proud and bewildered, as if he couldn't quite believe he belonged in a room full of applause. I watched him accept his diploma, and something inside me clicked into place with the clarity of a lock. I thought of the boy who stood by an exam gate with an umbrella, the boy who held my hand steady outside my dorm, the boy who turned scars into bamboo. I thought of the way he waited without asking to be chosen. When the ceremony ended and the graduates spilled onto the lawn for photos, I walked straight to him, ignoring the curious faces. I had saved for months from tutoring and shifts, buying a simple ring that looked like it belonged on hands that built things, and turned as I approached, smiling, and then froze when I dropped to one knee on the grass. People gasped. Someone laughed. Someone shouted, "Say yes!" before I even understood the question. My heart pounded so violently I could hear it in my teeth. I looked up at him and spoke loudly enough that my fear couldn't swallow the words. And I said, "You are the best thing that ever showed up in my life. I don't want a love that hides in corners. I want a love that stands in the light and says, 'I'm here. So I'm here. Will you marry me?'" Anne's eyes filled immediately. And he did something I'd never seen him do in public. He didn't try to look controlled. He covered his mouth with his hand, shoulders shaking, and then he nodded hard, tears sliding down his face like permission. Yes, he managed. Yes, Lynn. 1,000 times yes. I stood, hands trembling, and slid the ring onto his finger. He grabbed me, lifted me slightly off the ground, and laughed through tears. The crowd clapped, phones flashing, in the chaos, and leaned close and whispered, voice thick, "You said you'd stay loudly." I grinned. "I did," I replied. "And you clean slate? You're not blank anymore. You're yours." Later, after the photos and hugs and the dizzy noise, we walked away from the campus together. The sun hit my hairpin, making the small carving gleam, and brushed his fingers against it gently, a touch that felt like gratitude made physical. The future waited, full of ordinary problems. Bills, work, distances, moods. None of it looked easy. None of it looked impossible either. And laced his fingers through mine and said, as if it were a simple fact, "We'll do it together." For the first time in a long time, I believed him without flinching. In the weeks after, we learned that happiness is not a grand finale but a habit. Washing rice, fixing broken zippers, taking turns being brave, and calling each other home, even on days when home felt far away. Hoy sent photos from his new dorm and demanded updates like a tiny investigator. Yen sent gym selfies and declared she had outgrown sadness, and framed his diploma, then laughed at himself for caring, then cared anyway. When I caught my reflection with the hairpin on, I stopped seeing only grief. I started seeing inheritance, a line of women refusing to be erased, and whenever fear tried to knock, and opened the door first and said quietly and firmly, "Not today." We moved to the new province at the end of summer, renting a small apartment above a bakery that smelled like warm sugar at dawn, and bought a toolbox before he bought curtains, and I teased him until he teased me back, which felt like watching a flower learn sarcasm. On our first payday, we celebrated with cheap grilled corn and a long walk, counting the streetlights as if they were blessings. Some nights the old fears returned, mine about being chased, his about being discarded, and we practiced telling the truth anyway. "I'm scared today," one of us would say, and the other would answer, "Then I'll sit with you until it passes." We learned that love is not a rescue mission. It is a shared schedule, a set of repeated choices that never feel identical because we keep changing. When Ann signed his first work contract, he shook so hard the pen rattled, then laughed at himself and signed anyway. When I finished my first major editing project, I cried in the bathroom, then walked out and let him see my face, because hiding pride is also a kind of fear. On Sundays, we called Hui, who complained loudly about cafeteria food and pretended he didn't miss home. On quiet evenings, we cooked soup, and Ann would roll up his sleeve to show me the bamboo again, not to ask for comfort, but to remind himself he owned his body. By the time winter arrived, the city felt less like a test, and more like a place we had permission to build inside. Planning the wedding felt strangely similar to surviving exams. Everyone had opinions. Nobody wanted to admit they were nervous, and small paperwork threatened to ruin whole days. Yen appointed herself chief chaos manager and created spreadsheets with terrifying enthusiasm, claiming that if love was real, it could survive color palettes. Hugh returned during break and demanded to interview Anne like a detective, then secretly paid for our engagement photos when he thought I wasn't looking. Anne's father called once, voice stiff, asking if Anne would come home for a family gathering as if nothing had happened, and listened, thanked him for the invitation, and said, calmly, "No." After the call, Anne stared at the wall for a long time, then turned to me and said, "I thought saying no would feel like falling, but it feels like standing." We visited my mother again before the wedding. I placed a small bouquet beside her stone and told her, out loud, about Anne's bamboo tattoo, about Hai's keychain, about my fear finally losing its teeth. The wind moved through the trees, and I imagined my mother's laugh tucked inside it, amused that I was speaking to a quiet sky like it was a relative. On the morning we signed the marriage paperwork, Anne wore a plain white shirt and kept checking his pockets to make sure the pen hadn't vanished, as if adulthood might play tricks. I wore the hairpin and a soft smile that surprised me, because joy was not something I'd expected to carry so lightly. When the clerk stamped the documents and squeezed my hand and whispered, "You're my home," and for once the phrase didn't scare me with its permanence. It steadied me with it. At the small ceremony later, there were no fireworks, no dramatic music, only friends, laughter, and the smell of bakery sugar drifting upstairs like a blessing. We ate simple food, took ridiculous photos, and promised, in front of people who mattered, to keep choosing each other even when life got ordinary and messy. That night, after everyone left, and helped me unpin my hair, then carefully held the hairpin in his palm, as if it were a fragile heirloom. "Thank you for trusting me with this," he said. I leaned against his shoulder and answered, "Thank you for proving that trust can be safe." Years later, when someone asked how we met, I would usually say, "At an exam gate," because it was the shortest answer and the truest beginning. But the longer truth was that we met 100 times after that. In the way he offered water without asking for credit. In the way I learned to stop making jokes when honesty mattered. In the way we both practiced being gentle without being small. Sometimes I still dream of Vin's voice in a crowd, and I wake with my pulse racing, and never laughs at the nightmare. He just reaches for me, murmurs, "You're here," and waits until my body believes it. Sometimes and still dreams of a house where he is unwanted, and he wakes with his hands clenched. I rub the bamboo tattoo and remind him, "This is your body, this is your life, this is your choice. We are not perfect. We argue about stupid things, the right way to wash rice, the correct brightness of a desk lamp, whether a cat belongs indoors. Yet every argument ends with a softer ritual. An apology spoken without pride, a bowl of soup, a forehead pressed to a forehead, a promise renewed in ordinary language. Love, I learned, is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to keep walking even when fear tags along, breathing loudly behind you. If my mother could see me now, I think she would tap my forehead with the hairpin and tell me to stop overthinking, and I would laugh, and I would listen, and I would keep the hairpin where it belongs, holding my hair up, holding my head high, holding the past and the future in the same careful clasp. The year after the wedding taught us that romance does not disappear when daily life takes over. It simply changes costumes. I learned to love the sound of Anne's keys at the door, the way he kicked off his shoes like he was shedding the outside world, and learned to love my messy desk, even when paper scraps invaded the sofa like tiny flags of occupation. We adopted the neighbor's cat after it chose us by walking into our apartment and falling asleep on Anne's backpack, and Anne named it Bolt because it was fast, then apologized because he thought naming was a serious responsibility. On weekends we rode the bus to visit Hui, who pretended to be annoyed by our affection but still leaned into every hug. Hui's own graduation came faster than anyone expected. When he crossed the stage, he searched the crowd for me first, then for Anne, and his grin looked exactly like the boy who once believed a lucky dress could bend fate. After the ceremony, he grabbed my hand and said, "Thanks for showing up," and I realized the words belonged to all of us, the family we were born into, and the family we chose. That night we sat by the river again, older now, quieter in a different way, and pointed at the reflections on the water and said, "It's strange, the city changes, but the light keeps finding a way to stay." I rested my head on his shoulder and answered, "So do we." When strangers asked about the ring on Anne's finger, he would smile and say, "She proposed," with pride so clear it made my cheeks heat even years later. And when strangers asked why a woman like me had chosen a man like him, I stopped trying to be clever. I simply said the truth, because he is kind in a world that often forgets how. Once, on a random Tuesday, I found Anne standing in the kitchen holding my mother's hairpin in one hand and a sewing kit in the other. He looked guilty, as if he'd been caught touching history. "The clasp was loose," he said. I thought I could fix it. He had watched me fix buttons and zippers for years, and now he was applying the lesson back to me. I laughed, took the hairpin, and saw that he had reinforced the tiny hinge with the gentlest thread, the kind used for delicate fabrics. It was a small repair, barely visible, yet it made the hairpin feel sturdier in my palm. In that moment I understood something simple. Love is often maintenance, not rescue. It is the quiet work of keeping what matters from falling apart. I slid the hairpin back into my hair, pulled Anne close, and kissed him with the confidence of someone who had